Welcome back, boils and ghouls. It is trivia time. Using life models for illustrations is nothing new, and comics are no exception. Basically, everyone knows that Samuel L. Jackson has spent the better part of almost 2 decades now reprising his role as Nick Fury for Marvel, becoming the unequivocally recognized face of Nick Fury simply because Bryan Hitch decided to draw him into an issue of Ultimates on a whim. But Nick Fury is simply the most well-known and recent in a long lineage of similar stories. Unarguably one of the most famous comic titles in history, the X-Men are rather unique for a number of reasons, including having been created and later defined by an extraordinarily small and tight-knit group of individuals, despite the fact that this evolution occurred over multiple decades and titles. Writer Chris Claremont is universally recognized as the definitive voice of the Marvel Mutant universe, while John Byrne is likewise acknowledged as the man who largely defined what the X-Men's iconic members look like. John Byrne took over art duties on X-Men in 1977 from the legendary Dave Cockrum, who had helmed the first 2 years of the critical rebrand that would transform the X-Men from a failing reprint title in one of the most successful and influential comic book franchises of all time. While remaining extremely true to the ideas that Dave Cockrum brought to the X-Men redesign, John Byrne breathed an organic life into the original, sometimes stiff, if extraordinarily expressive designs of Dave Cockrum. John Byrne's designs would go on to effect a more real-world appearance that fans and readers still associate with the characters today. Somehow, John Byrne was able to translate each outlandish and bizarre character design into a real person that you felt like you could run into on the street, and this appears to have been for a very good reason. A frank and honest man, John Byrne has spoken for years about how he accomplished this task. The X-Men are in fact themselves based on real people. John Byrne doesn't use specific reference photos or anything, but imagining his comic book characters as real people apparently helps him wrap his head around how to draw them on paper. Comics are extremely hard to draw, at least hard to draw well, for numerous reasons. The main reason, though, is drawing the same figure from panel to panel, page to page, over and over again, day in and day out, making it look like the same imaginary person in the same imaginary place and telling a coherent story while doing it is hard. You have to be able to show these imagined people, places, and things from every conceivable angle. And it has to look good and tell a story while you're doing it. That's not easy. Given this fact, photo reference is nothing new to the comics field. Gene Colan based his Dracula from Marvel's Tomb of Dracula on Jack Palance. He would actually sit in front of a TV with a camera taking pictures of Jack Palance movies when they played for later use on specific reference. There are other artists today like Bryan Hitch and Greg Land that are kind of notorious for using direct references as well, or in the case of Greg Land, outright tracing pornography. This isn't John Byrne's style though. John Byrne simply uses actors' likenesses as an idea of what someone should generally look like, and then lets his imagination take care of the rest. It's not the normal kind of thing I talk about all the time, but I thought it was interesting enough to share with you all, especially considering I found a number of quotes where John Byrne actually states that he has done this for essentially every character he designed up until a certain point in the 90s. I obviously don't have time to tell you about all of them, but the most comprehensive and inclusive list of references that I could put together was for X-Men. The coolest thing about this list is the fact that it's not just the X-Men themselves either. If you make it to the end, I did put together a cool little bonus rogues gallery of other notorious X-Men characters and villains based on real people as well. So let's start with the leader of the X-Men himself, Charles Xavier. People said for years that Yul Brynner should have played Charles Xavier, at least before Patrick Stewart came around. Because of this, most people in the know about John Byrne's proclivity for references blindly assumed that Bryner was obviously John Byrne's reference for the X-Men's wheelchair-bound leader, but turns out they were wrong. John Byrne heard this so many times, he actually began to go out of his way to correct people, explicitly stating that prolific television actor King Curtis was in fact the actual face behind Charles Xavier, not Yul Brynner, as people had thought. While he has a ton of acting credits, this is especially ironic as many of King Curtis's most iconic credits are voice acting roles. During his tenure as artist, Byrne made innumerable and priceless contributions to the series, but undoubtedly one of Byrne's greatest contributions to the X-Tiles was Kitty Pryde. Introduced in 1980 to the X-Men universe, she wasn't the typical run-of-the-mill comic book female. She didn't have a perfect hourglass figure, enormous breasts, or even an exceptionally attractive face for that matter. Kitty Pryde was the first female comic book character I remember reading in mainstream comics that I felt was basically a real person. While Claremont's use of her character was undeniably important, much of Kitty Pryde's lasting appeal and staying power comes from John Byrne's original design. Kitty Pryde's also especially interesting, as it turns out that not only is Kitty based on a real person, she's actually cobbled together from a few various sources. Kitty Pryde's mother is iconic and prolific comic book writer and editor Mary Jo Duffy, who has worked for Marvel, DC, and Image Comics. And Kitty's father, Carmen, is based on a man of the same first name that John Byrne knows from his hometown of Walsall in England. The name Kitty Pryde was actually taken from a girl that John Byrne went to college with. John Byrne says he did take the girl's name, but that the real-life Kitty Pryde looks absolutely nothing like her comic book counterpart. In 1979, only months before Kitty Pryde's debut, the movie Alien hit theaters and the world was introduced to a certain badass heroine in the form of Ellen Ripley as portrayed by Sigourney Weaver. John Byrne has said he was going for something different than his usual Byrne girl with Kitty Pryde's design, and that her long and angular face is what he imagined a 13-year-old Sigourney Weaver would look like. Kitty Pryde was definitely anything but a typical Byrne girl, but there was someone to fit that description in the title. While he might have been trying something completely different with Kitty Pryde, John Byrne was still able to contribute one of the buxom Byrne girls he'd become so well known for in the form of Jean Grey, whose life model was Raquel Welch. Jean was always supposed to be the hot mousy chick in school, but it just never played until John Byrne got a hold of her. I distinctly remember picking up X-Men reprints of pre-Byrne era stuff and being super confused by the distinctly different look and feel of Jean Grey especially. John Byrne not only tweaked Jean Grey's costume, he changed Jean's fundamental appearance. That stupid bob in her hair was weird, and let's be honest, that Marvel Girl outfit was not doing her any favors. When John Byrne came onto the scene though, that skirt started shrinking quicker than my bank account at a comic convention, and Jean Grey quickly developed a more svelte, rounded, hourglass body, which is permanently stuck with her character. One half of the X-Men's Fastball special, Colossus, was based on an actor who I almost guarantee you would not recognize the name of. If, however, I told you Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies was the basis for Colossus, many more people would be able to conjure an image. Trust me, once you see it, there is no unseeing it. John Byrne apparently got never-ending shit for choosing actor Max Baer Jr. of Beverly Hillbillies fame for the face of the would-be artist and philosopher with nigh indestructible metal skin and a heart of gold, Peter Rasputin, but it works. His Colossus has never been matched in my opinion, and I don't care what the basis for it is, just that it worked perfectly. The freer, angrier side of the Fastball special, Wolverine, is a great example of precisely how John Byrne uses these likenesses. The most popular X-Men of all time and one of Marvel's most profitable characters as well is based on a supporting character played by a man whose name John Byrne doesn't even know. From a movie called Slapshot. Don't worry, I put a picture of the movie poster up because no one else has heard of it either. It's a Paul Newman hockey movie, but that's not important. What is important is that Wolverine has to be one of the most unlikely success stories of all time, and this is just icing on the cake. The guy from Slapshot's name is Paul Diamano, and he's in the movie for like 5 minutes. If you see a picture of him though, it's instantly undeniable. Not only does he look like Wolverine with the huge chops, if you look at those eyes, you can really see why John Byrne thought he would make a perfect Wolverine. The fact that Byrne didn't obsessively research Diamano to find out what he looked like in other movies or get stills of Slapshot also says a lot. John Byrne just got a glimpse of Paul Diamantino and instantly had what he needed to construct Wolverine's now iconic face from that in his mind. The one I've just never been able to see is Nightcrawler. John Byrne insists that Robert Walden is the basis for his face, but I don't know. I think that this is another prime example of how John Byrne's reference work differs from other artists. Perhaps it's Robert Walden's posture, his mannerisms, something that I'm not familiar enough with that John Byrne translated. I don't know. Nightcrawler has always been one of my favorite X-Men, so it was strange to find out that he was based on a supporting character from a Mary Tyler Moore spin-off show. I never watched it that much, I am familiar, but I was just never able to wrap my head around this one, despite the fact that John Byrne has stated over and over again that this is the case. And speaking of spin-offs, the most oblique reference for American audiences would be the recently revamped Moira McTaggart, who is based on an English actress named Hannah Gordon. Now, Hannah Gordon's a prolific actress, but probably best recognized by US audiences as Anthony Hopkins' wife in The Elephant Man. There was also a French actor who's the basis for Cyclops originally. Unfortunately, because John Byrne doesn't use actual stills and is far from obsessive about remembering any of this stuff, he has no idea who that guy is now. As John Byrne states, the X-Men weren't the only characters he based on real people, and perhaps the most famous case of this was the Hellfire Club. Now, interestingly, there's an episode of the British television show The Avengers called A Touch of Brimstone that features a league of baddies calling themselves the Hellfire Club, which Chris Claremont has said is the basis for the X-Men villains. What's more, Peter Wyngarde appears in this episode along with Diana Rigg, who played Emma Peel, and it was thought for many years that Diana Rigg was the basis for Emma Frost, the White Queen of the Hellfire Club. Emma Peel dresses up as the Queen of Sin in these high heels in A Touch of Brimstone, and Chris Claremont was obviously drawing from it for material, so it would make sense, except for the fact that John Byrne has said at the time he didn't even remember that episode of the Avengers and that none of his references were from that episode. He goes on to say that when he was first designing Emma Frost, Faye Dunaway was the one that came to mind as inspiration because she struck him as a real Ice Queen. She might not have been modeled off of Emma Peel, but Emma Frost was certainly named after the Avengers character, as were a few other Hellfire Club members. As I mentioned before, Peter Wyngarde is indeed in the Avengers episode A Touch of Brimstone. And while Diana Rigg / Emma Peel may not have been used as a life model, Peter Wyngarde is quite obviously the basis for Jason Wyngarde. Apparently, John Byrne had wanted to name Jason Wyngarde after a character that Peter Wyngarde had played named Jason King, and the original name was going to be Peter King. Someone got it turned around though, and in the end, the name ended up becoming Jason Wyngarde. Sebastian Shaw was based on Robert Shaw, instantly recognizable as the psychotic, drunken fisherman Quint from Steven Spielberg's immortal Jaws, who's almost identical in name as well. Harry Leland is world-famous actor and director Orson Welles, named after Welles' characters Harry Lime from The Third Man and Jed Leland from Citizen Kane. Orson Welles also happens to be the only person who John Byrne used an actual photo reference of, and the funny thing about this is that when people started catching on to the fact that John Byrne was using references, they all thought that Harry Leland was based on Ernest Borgnine. The name should have given away, but John Byrne always thinks it's funny when people bring it up. The list continues with Donald Pierce, modeled off of Donald Sutherland, who at the time was extremely famous for doing a movie called MASH, even though most people today recognize him from either Animal House or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, both released in 1978. Don't worry, we're basically done. I only have one more, but I swear I saved the best for last. No Marvel Comics trivia episode would be complete without talking about comics' greatest supervillain, Jim Shooter. But how could he possibly fit into all of this? So apparently the raging dickbag from both the Avengers and X-Men comics, not to mention the X-Men the Animated Series cartoon, Henry Gyrick, is based on none other than everyone's favorite person, Jim Shooter. I don't know how I didn't notice this all these years, but now every time I see Henry Gyrick, I fall out of my chair laughing. The best part about this is the fact that Jim Shooter was the actual writer on the Avengers story that John Byrne created Henry Gyrick for. Jim Shooter has had more people make fun of him in his own books than every other writer on the planet combined. It is madness. And apparently there were a lot of people in on this joke over the years as well, because even his appearances on the X-Men cartoon show look dead on like Jim Shooter. Of all the models and references John Byrne used over the years, ironically, his jab at one-time Marvel editor and tyrant Jim Shooter seems to be the most direct and the longest lasting. Anyways, kind of light episode, I know, kind of fluffy. I'm working on some heavier stuff right now, and I felt like having some fun. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If not, tune in tomorrow. Totally different fact about a totally different thing. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button. If you really enjoyed what you saw, Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you keep up with these doses of trivia that I'm dropping all the time. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, get in the comment section below. Let me know. I'd like to hear from you guys. If you want to see an episode about something, get in the comment section below and let me know as well. I'll do my best to make something happen for you. Thanks again for sticking with me. I really hope you enjoyed. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics. Happy New Year's, guys.